two horns called dorsal horn. Dorsal horn has sensory neurons. So cell bodies of sensory neurons. Dorsal horn contains cell bodies of sensory neurons. These are the ventral horns, which contain cell bodies of motor neurons. So the gray matter is in a butterfly-like shape. They're called horns. You have a dorsal horn and a ventral horn. Dorsal horn is where you have sensory neurons. You have cell bodies of sensory neurons. And ventral horn is where you have cell bodies of motor neurons. Rest of this is basically white matter. Okay? Okay, all of this is white matter. This is where the axons are running through. Now, coming off the dorsal horn, okay? Coming off the dorsal one, you have this area, which is called the dorsal root. Okay? Coming off the white matter, which you have a dorsal root, it comes off the dorsal horn. You see the dorsal horn is right there and it comes off right there. This is the dorsal root. Dorsal root contains axons of sensory neurons. The horns contain the cell bodies, where the roots contain the axons. In the dorsal root, so this entire thing is dorsal root. In the dorsal root, you actually see this protrusion. That is called the dorsal root ganglion. In the dorsal root, you actually have a ganglion. Okay, what is a ganglion? Group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Because this is a spinal cord. This is coming off the spinal cord. So do you see it starts becoming the peripheral nervous system? Mm-hmm. Anytime you have cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, it's called a ganglion. This is a ganglion. But this ganglion is located within the dorsal root. This is why it's called a dorsal root ganglion. What type of cell bodies does it have? Motor or sensory? Dorsal root ganglion contains cell bodies of what type of neuron? Sensory. Okay. Sensory cell bodies. Okay. Does that make sense? Right here, we have a ventral root. Okay. This is a ventral root. Ventral root contains axons of what type of neurons? Motor. Okay? Does that make sense? Anytime you hear dorsal, it's sensory. Anytime you hear ventral, it is motor. If you're talking about the horn, it's cell bodies. If you're talking about the roots or the nerves, then it's white matter, or it's axons. Okay? Yes?
And ventral roots do not have ganglion?
No.
Okay, only the dorsal.
Only in dorsal root. You do not see any protrusion because in the ventral root there is no ganglion. The ganglion is only in the dorsal root. So it's called the dorsal root ganglion. Yes?
You said for horns, they contain cell bodies and the roots are the contain axons?
Uh-huh. Because horn are gray matter, roots are white matter. Now, the dorsal root and the ventral root come together, forming spinal nerve. Okay? Dorsal root and the ventral root come together, they combine, forming the spinal nerve. So spinal nerve has axons of both type of neurons. It has motor fibers as well as sensory fibers. Does that make sense? So it has sensory fibers as well as it has motor fibers. Sensory fibers go what direction? So when I burn my hand,
Peripheral to the brain.
when I burned my hand, okay, my information went into my sensory nerve, okay, my spinal nerve. The burning sensation went in that direction. It went through my spinal nerve, entered which part of my spinal nerve? The sensory fiber. Went up, so it went this way, and entered basically this area, and from there it went up. You see it now into the spinal cord. Spinal cord is a connection between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So my spinal cord took that information up, my dorsal part, okay? And when it came back down, it came back from basically my motor went this way, and the information went this way. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's what you have to know. Spinal nerve contains both fibers, sensory fibers as well as motor fibers. Okay? Roots and horns, purely sensory or purely motor. And right in here, this is called the central canal right here. Okay, now let's talk about the protection. How is our brain or the central nervous system protected? Now, our central nervous system is protected by 4 different mechanisms. One is skull and the vertebrae. Okay? The skull encloses the brain, therefore it's a protective measure. The vertebrae encloses the spinal cord, therefore it's a protective measure. Other way is CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is actually within our brains. We don't have time to go into detail, but in the lab you will see that within our brain or cerebrum, we actually have 4 ventricles. We have 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle. Those ventricles are lined by epidermal cells, which basically produce and secrete the CSF. Okay? So, basically CSF is produced by ventricles. What are ventricles? Lateral, 3rd, 4th. Okay, we have 2 lateral ventricles, we have 1/3 ventricle, and we have 1/4 ventricle. Okay. It's produced by the ventricles. Now, what is the function of CSF? It's a fluid. It basically bathes, okay? It surrounds the brain. So therefore, it acts like a shock absorber, okay? When you're on a roller coaster and isn't your head going in, thrown in every single direction, can you imagine if you had no fluid, what your brain would be hitting your skull every single second? Does it happen? No, because you have a fluid, okay? So when you're bouncing, the shock is absorbed by that cerebrospinal fluid, okay? It also creates a barrier between the brain and that side, okay? Because anything that enters, again, has to go through the cerebrospinal fluid. So main is protection. It cushions the brain, okay? Location, subarachnoid space. We'll talk about what a subarachnoid space is in a little bit later, but right now just know location is subarachnoid space. So first function or first protection is skull and vertebrae. Plan B is CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, which is produced by the ventricles. It's a fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. It's found in a space called the subarachnoid space. It's a shock absorber, okay, and it bathes the spinal cord and the and the brain. Have you ever seen where a baby, okay, has a cone head? Not right after delivery, but maybe within 6-7 months, sometimes they have a cone head. Okay? The reason that happens is because the baby's bones are not fused yet, and they have too much CSF. Therefore, they have too much fluid, and it starts expanding. The brain starts to expand. It's called hydrocephalus when you have too much fluid. In adults, that doesn't happen because our bones are already fused, and if you have too much fluid, you only have one. Basically, think of a skull as a container. Okay, it cannot increase. What happens if you're supposed to have set amount of tissue, set amount of fluid? Okay, what happens if the tissue increases? I mean, what happens if the fluid level increases? Then your tissue has to decrease. Okay, your intracranial pressure will increase, but at some point, it's going to keep on increasing. But can your brain expand? I mean, your skull expand? No. So therefore, what happens is then your tissue will start to degenerate. Okay. The third one is blood-brain barrier. We kind of already talked about that. What is the function? Protection, right? It forms a barrier between the brain or the central nervous system and the rest of the body. What glial cell forms the blood-brain barrier? Astrocyte. Astrocyte. Now we're going to talk about meninges. And I think this is the last section. Meninges. Location around brain and spinal cord. So the meninges, basically it wraps or encloses the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? Function is protection. Okay. 3 connective tissue layers. The meninges is made up of 3 connective tissue layers. I'm starting from basically this. I'm starting from the brain, going to the skull. Okay. Pia matter touches the brain. Okay. Then you have arachnoid matter. And then you have dura matter. Touches the skull. Does that make sense? We have 3 distinct layers: pia matter, arachnoid matter, and then the dura matter. Because these are located between each layer, you have spaces that have been created. So let me erase this so I can draw. So let's say this is the brain. The layer that actually touches the brain is called what? Pia matter. A layer that actually, what is the second layer? Arachnoid. What is this layer? Dura matter. And this is the skull. So here's the brain. There's the skull. Do you see between each layer you have created a space? So, how would you call this space? Let's start from here. This is the dura matter. How would you call the space which is located right above the dura matter? Epidural space. how would you call the space which is located below or between the dura and the arachnoid? No. The space is located between the dura and the arachnoid. Subdural space. So epidural, subdural. How would you call that rest one? No, it didn't. This is the arachnoid. How would I call the space which is located below the arachnoid? Subarachnoid. Subarachnoid space. Okay? Subarachnoid space. Does that make sense? So there are three spaces because there's space between the three layers. Subarachnoid space is found below the arachnoid matter. Subdural space is found below the dura matter. Epidural space is found above the dura. Epi means above, sub means below. Okay? And the ending tells you is it above or below which layer. Does that make sense?
But when are you switch? Subdura should be on the brain?
No, this is arachnoid matter.
Oh.
So the red is a pia, blue is the dura, and then green is the arachnoid. Does that make sense? Okay. What has there anyone ever had a child? Who's ever gone through labor? Okay. What did you receive to alleviate the pain? Epidural. Where do you think epidural was injected? Where do you think that needle went to inject that?
She didn't know what she was doing.
Okay. So epidural means that the injection entered this site right here. It went through the vertebrae and pierced, so you pierced your vertebrae and it's right above the dura mater. So the medicine was injected right here and it numbed your dura, numbed this one, it meant roots, and numbed your nerves. Does that make sense? Now, it occurred in the spinal cord. So spinal cord are nerves, right? It's white matter. So it tends to, epidural in your spinal cord tends to tends to, what's that word? Not the word. I know what I want to say, I can't think of it. It just, I can't think of the word. Never mind. You guys understand what the epidural is supposed to do? Numb. It kind of numbs that area of the spinal cord. Therefore, whatever branches that spinal cord is giving up to your pelvic organs, if that's numbed, you do not feel it. This is why you don't feel, well, technically you're not supposed to feel the process delivery. Okay? So it numbs that whole area. Now this is showing you just saying, here's the brain section, then you have pia, arachnoid, and dura, and then the spaces. This is just a flow chart for you. It just kind of shows you meninges, 3 layers, cerebrospinal fluid. There's just a flow chart. Okay, we're done. We don't have time to do class activity. No, we end at what time? We end at 1.